Redditors who remarried an ex-spouse, why did you divorce and how did you get back together? My great-aunt and uncle did this. He was still suffering from the trauma of his World War II service with the Marines in the Pacific when she had a stillborn child and was told she'd never have kids, and things just imploded. They got divorced. My aunt traveled to Asia and the Middle East for like 9 months, while for him it was more or less the wake-up call that he was still fucked up from seeing his buddies get blown up. She came back, and he had completely changed, and they completely reconnected. Keep in mind, this was the 50s, so the thought of a 30-something Marine vet going to therapy and being in touch with his PTSD triggers and shit was pretty fucking life-altering. Her next planned trip was Europe and she asked if he wanted to come along and his response was, "I figured they'd send me there to fight Hitler, but I guess this works too." They called my grandma from Gdansk maybe 2 months later to let them know they had gotten remarried in the church my great-grandparents had gotten married in, and were together until Aunt Betty died about 3 years ago. Uncle Frank died a year after her, and used to tell us all the time that he missed his girlfriend. This thread needs a happy story. My first husband and I married pretty young after college. We were generally happy, but it seemed like our lives were moving in different directions, geographically and metaphysically. We split up. We dated other people, went through the motions, mechanically loved other people, sure, but without the sense of destiny and certainty we had with one another. Finally, over a decade after breaking it off, we got back together and have never been happier. Now we have the life experience to know that what we have is irreplaceably special. The stupid small things that seemed problematic back then, we now know to be non-issues. We've seen so many other couples fight and struggle for what we have naturally. We're so lucky. My parents got pregnant in their senior year of high school and married over the summer on my mom's 18th birthday because she wouldn't ask her parents to sign the marriage certificate. My brother was born a few months later and they stuck it out for a year before divorcing. Then my dad got drafted to Vietnam, and when he came home 19 months later went straight to my mom to see my brother. They remarried, trying to do the right thing. All they got out of that marriage was me. They divorced a few years later before my first birthday. They've always remained civil, even friendly, but I have no idea how they stayed married as long as they did. They're very different, non-compatible personalities. A family friend did this. They split up the first time because she was cheating on him and they both remarried. Original wife then cheated on her new husband with original husband, and the original husband left his new wife for the original wife *. They remarry. Everyone is counting down the days until it goes wrong. Original wife then cheats on and leaves original husband. They divorce. Again. To make this even worse, the new husband of original wife hung himself when she left him, and new wife of original husband had a nervous breakdown. Edit, I'm aware this is hard to follow. Here's a slightly clearer explanation I gave in another comment. A guy, we'll call him Pratt, marries a woman who we'll call Witch. Witch cheats on Pratt with a guy named Poor Soul, so Pratt and Witch divorce. Pratt meets another woman, Nice Lady, and they marry. Witch marries Poor Soul. Witch cheats on her new husband, Poor Soul, with Pratt. Pratt and Witch decide to remarry, so Pratt divorces Nice Lady, who has a nervous breakdown, and Witch divorces Poor Soul, who then commits suicide. Pratt and Witch get married again. Witch cheats on Pratt, again, with VW Dude. Pratt and Witch divorce, again. I knew a guy whose wife and kids left him because he was an alcoholic. Kept getting arrested and couldn't hold a job. He finally decided to get sober and quit drinking. Started his own rental property management business. Got his feet on the ground and started to reach out and help other alcoholics. Eventually got back together with his ex-wife and they got remarried. The sad part is that he died in a freak accident fixing their RV a few years ago. Then his son died a few months later in a school shooting. My mom did this, with my now former stepfather. I can say for certain that it was daddy-father issues. Edit, my apologies. Apparently the phrase daddy issues carries some sexist connotations that I was unaware of. Her father died when she was young, and it left her with an unresolved terror of loneliness and abandonment, so she kept getting sucked back into a toxic relationship wherein both she and I were getting abused. It took her a long time to begin understanding her own root causes, way too long after the fact, but at least she finally and completely kicked him to the curb. My mom and dad married out of high school. When they were 26, they got divorced. They divorced because of the stress of 3 kids. My dad was in the Air Force and was deployed all the time, and while neither parent has confirmed it, but based on some jokes, I believe my dad was also unfaithful, and in general he was just very immature. My mom left him because, in her words, she had 3 kids to take care of, grad school to get through, and didn't have time for his bullshit. They both went on to have different relationships and lives. They barely saw each other unless it was to trade us kids off. Then around the time my sister and I started playing sports, my dad started to come around more to watch us. We lived about 6 hours away and mom let him stay at the house when needed. He went from sleeping on the couch to her bedroom within a football season. They got married again the next summer after 6 to 7 years apart. Been together ever since and practically do everything together. I lived with a woman for a couple years, broke up badly. She called me decades later and said I was her best boyfriend ever and wanted to know if I wanted to try again. It lasted a week. Even though it didn't work out, we smoothed things over and still have a friendship. I don't regret any of it. I see mostly tales of remarital woe here. I'll offer you a positive rebuttal. My mom and dad split when I was 5 and my sister was 7. They were young with 2 kids and incredibly broke. I don't know the full story or all the details, but I'm sure those things all just caught up to them in the end. It was a really rough divorce, especially for us kids. They were separated for 3 years or so. Lived in separate apartments, etc. My mom started seeing a new guy. Although we never saw my dad with anyone, I'm sure he was seeing people too. Some years passed, their rebounds came and went. They both got stable jobs and started seeing each other more. Showing up at Christmas together, attending soccer games together. When I was 9 or so, they decided to rent a house. 1 year later, they found out they were pregnant with my little sister. They got remarried about a year after my little sister was born. That was 21 years ago. They are sincerely one of the happiest couples I've ever been around. You never would have think it 25 years or so ago. Sometimes space and refocus is actually all you need. Happy Christmas. The wife and I got in a year-long fight. We married young at 22 and were not on the same page about being married. She wanted to sow her wild oats and I wanted us to start growing up and take on more responsibility. We ultimately got divorced at my urging because I wanted to move on. About a month after the divorce was final, we started talking to each other like adults. We had some hard conversations about what wasn't working. We started dating after cautiously considering if we were frickin' crazy. A year later we got married in Vegas. It's been 16 years since the divorce and we're happily married with 2 great kids. Our journey has taken some wrong turns, but it's our journey and we wouldn't change it for anything. The lesson we share with everyone who asks is getting married young isn't for everyone. Don't rush into a relationship. Make sure to make time to be yourself and appreciate your partner for who they are, not who you want them to be. This will be a sweeter answer than expected. Not me, but a client of mine was working to get citizenship. They had been married back in their home country and had immigrated to the US. Because they weren't sure if their country's marriage was legally recognized in the US, they decided to get divorced and then remarried in the US. I dated my girlfriend for about 5 years before we split up. We had been living together, but her anxiety and my depression led to a pretty terrible situation. After being apart for 1.5 years, we had both worked on our mental health and gotten good jobs. We both realized that we liked just talking to each other more than being with anyone else. We got married in 2017 and are still going strong. I was contracting a couple years ago and my headhunter would take me for lunch every couple months. The last lunch we had together before he went into negotiations for my next contract, he was very sad and depressed. I asked him what was the matter, and he basically just broke down and told me that he was getting a divorce because she was cheating. Being of an advanced age, I had many friends get divorced around that time, so I kinda knew the routine. I talked with him, and told him how dudes with good jobs are pretty in demand post-35. He thanked me for listening and really went to bat for me in negotiations and got me the max salary for the contract. I told this story a bunch as an example of being nice to everyone. You never know what could happen. However, I kinda stopped telling this story because my wife and I were out at the movies a year or so later. We see my recruiter and start talking and catching up. Then this woman walks up to him and he introduces her as his wife. I say, "Oh hey, congrats, I'm glad you met someone." He looks at me a little panicked and starts awkwardly explaining that he remarried the same woman. Haven't talked to him since, so I don't know the full story. I just hope he's happy, he was a nice dude. I have 2 friends whose parents have done this, or at least divorced and got back together even though they didn't remarry. In both cases their moms filed for divorce, and made the decision to return when their ex-husband's health was failing. One dad sadly passed away and the other dad is in remission, still with his wife, but doesn't realize the Catholic Church has her listed as a widow. I find some similarities in the 2 families. Both moms show narcissistic tendencies with favoritism and martyrdom. My husband just reminded me of friends of ours that divorced after raising kids and then recently got back together after divorcing 10 years ago. Raising their kids was super stressful for her because he woke up for work at 2 a.m. and so after 6 p.m. she had to keep 4 kids quiet. His chronic lack of sleep meant he was super particular about the tidiness of the house, and by time they got the twins out of the house they had been ready to split for years. 10 years, grandkids, and wisdom later they decided they really did still like each other and that the situation they were in just wasn't ideal. We married pretty young, 19 me, 21 meters at the time, so I used to love telling people that since men mature much later in life, I had to divorce him to let him grow up a bit and then took him back later when he did just that. That is only just a portion of why our first marriage fell apart. Hindsight is so crystal clear, so now I can look back and say it was a huge combination of factors that went wrong: my post-parting depression after first son's traumatic birth, my husband's PTSD as it was forming from the trauma experienced during his military and law enforcement career and lack of seeking therapy, the immense turnaround of life that happens with a special needs child, financial problems arising from baby's hospital, medical bills, just to name a few. So, originally married for 7 years. Had our 2 sons during that time, then divorced for 7, then reunited and have now been married for 8. To answer your question, I think we'd never stopped loving each other while divorced. Both dated and he even got engaged once, but more and more whenever we saw each other to swap kids. I was on West Coast and he on East. Our original love for each other just intensified until one kid's drop off when he let me stay at his place before my return flight the next day, and we, well, got our groove back on while sneaking around the house late at night like teenagers. But I won't lie, this second time around has not been cake. It was really rough about 2 to 3 years ago due to a lot of life changes that happen when elderly parents get ill, die, but we stuck through it. He went to therapy, I did a lot of soul searching and self-assessment, and I'm happy to say that today, we are now in our early 40s, our marriage is doing really well. It's so cheesy, I know, but I really do believe deep down that love does conquer all. If you love someone so deeply, fight for it. Obviously, both people have to feel the same way though. No relationship is perfect, but if you can even sense a bit of light at the end of that tunnel, slap yourself in the face to wake up and figure out what exactly must be done to repair and salvage it, again, if the other person wants to as well. My husband still brings out the crazy in me, but he also brings out the best in me and has been my only supporter when no one else would. He's a wonderful dad to our boys and I feel so blessed for that. Plus, I have worked too damn hard these past 2 decades to train him to be the man he is today, JK kinda, for me to just let some other woman walk in and be like, "Oh, you're such an amazing man." Yeah, thanks, I did that. We never got married, but we're together for 7 years. We broke up because I was planning to move out of the country after graduating, was an older student, I was 29 at that point. We were best friends and stayed best friends throughout it, though. But circumstances made it impossible for me to see the plans through, and I went cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and landed in the psych ward, like you do. He drove me to intake, stayed during my admitting, and came to see me every single day. He's everything good in this world. Needless to say, we got back together 2 years ago and we're in it to win it. True love isn't what movies and shit make it out to be. True love is bringing someone socks that actually fit their ridiculously tiny feet when they're trapped in the psych ward. I left my ex when he started doing drugs. I got full custody, it was so bad. He got sober after losing his kids. I got sick. Years later I was so sick I couldn't deal and he let me move in with him. Then I bought a house and he moved in with me. He's 49 and keeps getting hotter and hotter. No gray hair. Sexy dad bod. Dating in your 40s as a female sucks ass FYI. Most men are questionable at this point. He's super in love with me and a great provider and dad. I've been fighting it, but it's been slowly becoming a thing. My ex's parents got divorced when he was about 23. I entered the picture when he was 28. They were hanging out a lot and I thought it was kinda weird. I was sure they were on their way to getting back together. They're both kind of fucked up toxic PPL. Always really nice to me though. Mom is an alcoholic that can't adult and dad is emotionally needy and codependent and super lonely. Eventually my ex began to think they were going to get back together too. Then mom started fucking some married dude at work that she thought was her BF, spoiler, he wasn't, and telling everyone about it. Dad went back into being lonely and depressed and hating her. My ex has to take care of both of them in their own ways and it would just be easier for him if they did get back together. Not at all the same thing, but my wife and I met in middle school. Lost our virginities to each other at 14. Dated for a year. Broke up. Did the whole Facebook thing where you say, we should totally catch up for a coffee one time, and never did. Sort of said that for years. One time we actually did meet up though on a whim. We each had different partners at the time. The attraction was immediate. Been married 8 years. Have 3 kids. Pretty great overall. I actually have a really heartfelt story about my aunt and uncle. They originally were high school sweethearts, married young, had 2 kids, were together for 25 years. My uncle had a really bad drinking problem, and they were constantly unhappy, so my aunt filed for divorce. My uncle's drinking got worse then, and he basically drank himself to death. He ended up going to the hospital and was really sick. They detoxed him for 2 weeks and he never touched a bottle of alcohol again. He was sober for 2 years, and had a stroke. It really fucked him up and he hasn't fully recovered from it. This caused my aunt and uncle to get back together though. After his stroke she would visit him every day in the hospital, and eventually had him come back home so she could make sure he was taken care of and safe. He could barely walk, and his swallowing was affected, so there was a high choking risk. He eventually recovered to the point he could take care of himself, but they are still living together and sleep in the same bed again, although they haven't remarried.